Stop whatever you are doing right now. Close your eyes and try to imagine the most unbearable, stinking scent you have ever encountered in your entire life. Maybe it is the smell of a rotting animal left to decay on the side of a dirt road. Or perhaps the suffocating odor of a shattered sewer baking under the relentless midday sun. Now, multiply that nauseating sensation by 100. Imagine that there is absolutely nowhere to run, because this foul air is the very oxygen you must breathe from the moment you wake up in the darkness, until the second you fall into a restless nightmare. Welcome to the visceral, ruthless, and absolutely terrifying reality of the Middle Ages. The terrifying truth is that the concept of hygiene we take for granted today would have sounded like absolute witchcraft or pure madness to your ancestors. Don't let movies fool you with their romanticized visions of peasants with perfect white teeth and lightly dusted tunics. This is not a fairy tale. This is hell on earth. If it were you, you wouldn't survive 24 hours in this dark, bloody, and desperate era. Today, on Grim Medieval, I am going to tear apart the illusions and expose the raw, unfiltered truth to you. We will drag you through the muddy, disease-ridden streets, into the claustrophobic and infested bedrooms, and through the brutal, grotesque medical rituals that doomed millions of screaming souls. These are the dark secrets conveniently washed away from your traditional history books. Imagine yourself walking through the winding, narrow streets of London or Paris in the 11th century. The sky above is a perpetual, gloomy gray. The wooden houses lean precariously over the pathways, completely blocking out the life-giving sunlight and trapping the foul air below. But the real horror lies beneath your feet. The ground you walk on is not just dirt or mud. It is a dark, sticky, and festering substance that seems almost alive. What covers the streets of these medieval metropolises is a putrid, fermenting mixture of rotting food scraps, the fresh excrement of thousands of free-roaming animals, discarded bloody viscera thrown out by local butchers, and the overflowing contents of chamber pots from the entire desperate population. There were no underground sewers to carry the filth away. There was no regular garbage collection to save the citizens from their own decay. The open street was the final stinking destination for everything unwanted and rotting. To even attempt to walk down the street, you would be forced to wear elevated wooden shoes known as pattens. These were crude footwear with towering wooden soles designed specifically to keep your fragile leather shoes away from that toxic, bubbling mixture. On rainy days, this river of human feces and mud could easily reach as high as your ankles, threatening to swallow you whole. The atmosphere was thick and suffocating, but the danger did not just lurk on the ground. It fell from the sky. At any given moment, a wooden window shutter on the second floor might violently swing open. You might hear the desperate, chilling warning cry of Gardy-Loo, which essentially meant, watch out for the water. But it was never just water. A heavy wooden bucket filled to the brim with aged, fermenting urine and fresh human feces would be blindly hurled directly into the public street below. This disgusting payload would violently splash onto any unfortunate, terrified soul who was not fast enough to run for their life. This nightmare was such a common occurrence that desperate laws were eventually written to try and control the dumping times. But the enforcement was an absolute joke against the biological needs of thousands of people trapped in a concrete cage. The open ditches that ran down the center of these dark streets were supposed to drain the rainwater. Instead, they constantly became choked and clogged with the rotting corpses of stray dogs, dead cats, and mountains of household decay. These blockages created stagnant dams of pure putridity, serving as the perfect warm nurseries for swarms of rats and the devastating plague they carried. But this urban filth was not merely a cosmetic issue. It was a literal death trap waiting to finish off the weak and the young. The rivers, which should have been sacred sources of life and hydration, were aggressively transformed into massive, flowing sewers of black water. The Thames in London and the Seine in Paris swallowed thousands of tons of raw, untreated biological waste every single day. The local tanneries were perhaps the most brutal contributors to this bloody mess. To soften animal hides, the tanners completely submerged the skins in massive vats filled with old, stale human urine and dog feces. They would then dump their highly toxic, chemical, and organic runoff straight into the very same river. Just a few yards downstream, desperate washerwomen would be on their knees trying to scrub clothes clean, and local brewers would be hauling up buckets of this contaminated water to make ale for the masses. It was an endless, closed loop of deadly contamination that would eventually devour entire communities. Amidst this suffocating chaos, there existed a specific profession so vile, so thoroughly repulsive, that very few men possessed the stomach to endure it. Yet, without them, the entire city would have literally drowned in its own waste. These men were known as the gong farmers. They were the unsung, heavily marginalized heroes of medieval survival, condemned to work exclusively under the cover of darkness. Because polite society could not bear to look at them or smell their horrific labor, the gong farmers would descend into the deep, dark cesspits of grand castles and wealthy estates, while the rich slept comfortably above. Picture yourself climbing down into a pitch-black, damp, and overwhelmingly foul-smelling hole in the earth. You are standing in human waste up to your waist, armed with nothing but a simple wooden shovel and a bucket. Your singular task is to manually remove tons of tightly packed, fermenting human feces. The risk of this job was absolutely immense. Countless gong farmers died horrific deaths down in the darkness. They were frequently suffocated to death by the invisible toxic gases that built up in the pits, or they contracted lightning-fast, bloody infections that tore apart their bodies from the inside out. They were paid handsomely for their time, but they were treated like lepers. They were forced to live in completely segregated areas at the edge of town because the suffocating stench of their daily torture permanently soaked into their skin. No amount of scrubbing could ever extinguish that smell. The medieval city, therefore, was not simply dirty because people were lazy. It was a complex, horrific biological machine where managing the daily filth was a desperate, bloody fight against nature itself. There is a very popular, persistent belief that absolutely nobody bathed during the Middle Ages, that generation after generation lived their entire brutal lives, encased in a thick, dark crust of sweat and filth. The historical truth is far more complex and, ironically, far more tragic. In the early medieval period, public baths were actually relatively common. Inheriting the traditions of the fallen Roman Empire, many cities boasted bathhouses where terrified citizens could attempt to wash the grime away, socialize, and occasionally even eat a meager meal. However, as the dark centuries slowly ground on, an icy shadow of absolute terror began to fall over the seemingly innocent act of sinking one's tired body into a tub of hot water. The twisted, desperate medical minds of the era operated on the theory of miasmas and the precarious balance of bodily humors. These so-called doctors began to aggressively preach a terrifying new doctrine. They claimed that hot water physically forced the pores of the human skin to violently dilate and open up. And wide-open pores, according to these learned men, were practically open invitations for bad, infected air and horrific diseases to directly enter the vulnerable body. They were utterly terrified of the Black Death. Suddenly, Taking a bath was no longer seen as a basic act of hygiene. It transformed into a deadly game of Russian roulette with the Grim Reaper. The twisted logic dictated this. The natural accumulation of thick dirt and dried human sweat slowly formed an impenetrable physical armor on your skin. This disgusting crust was believed to completely seal the body away from the deadly, malignant influences floating in the dirty air around them. To intentionally scrub away this protective armor of filth was considered a recklessly suicidal act of absolute madness. Kings and queens, the very individuals who possessed the supreme power to command endless hot water and perfumed soap, proudly boasted about how they avoided bathing like the plague. Queen Isabella I of Castile, one of the most powerful women in history, famously bragged that she had only fully bathed exactly 2 times in her entire life. Once on the day she was born, and once right before her wedding day. Centuries later, King Louis XIV, the great Sun King, was still heavily influenced by this dark tradition. He was historically infamous for smelling so unbelievably horrific that his terrified courtiers had to literally hold heavily perfumed handkerchiefs over their noses whenever he entered the room, just to stop themselves from violently vomiting in his presence. But if they absolutely refused to climb into a bathtub, how did they survive the visible physical accumulation of dirt on their bodies? The secret lay in their clothing, specifically linen. There was a powerful, widespread belief that if you frequently changed your linen undergarments, the porous white fabric would somehow magically absorb the dark impurities and the foul sweat directly from your skin, effectively cleaning your body through a bizarre form of medieval osmosis. Therefore, publicly displaying bright, impeccably white linen cuffs and collars became the absolute ultimate symbol of high status and supreme cleanliness. You could be secretly covered from head to toe in aggressive fungal infections and rotting, rancid sweat beneath your heavy robes. But if the edges of your linen were pure white, polite society considered you completely clean. Those who were too desperately poor to afford a massive wardrobe of clean linen, or the incredibly expensive hard soap made from animal fat and harsh wood ash, simply surrendered. They lived and died buried in their own accumulated filth. To somehow mask the overwhelming, omnipresent stench of the unwashed human body, the wealthy resorted to incredibly aggressive, almost violent tactics of perfumery. They constantly carried pomanders. These were heavy, perforated metal spheres tightly packed with exotic spices, pungent musk, and strong aromatic herbs. They would frantically hold these pomanders against their noses the second the smell of humanity or the raw sewage of the street became too suffocating to endure. Heavy woolen clothes were locked away in dark wooden chests, stuffed full of dried flowers, not out of any sense of romance, but out of a desperate, primal need for olfactory survival. The infamous odor of sanctity, frequently referenced in dark religious texts of the time, was in brutal reality the absolute opposite of the natural human scent. Fanatical monks and isolated hermits who intentionally chose to live in absolute crusty filth were revered as spiritually superior beings. By intentionally mortifying their own flesh through extreme physical discomfort and an unbearable stench, they believed they were violently rejecting worldly vanity and drawing closer to their God through suffering. The life-giving element of water had been slowly twisted in the medieval mind into an agent of absolute terror and painful death. If the outdoor streets were a flowing nightmare of disease and the human body was considered a sealed temple of holy dirt, surely their homes offered some small shred of comfort. You would be dead wrong. Let us step inside a typical medieval residence. Look down and prepare to be horrified. The vast majority of desperate peasant dwellings featured simple, damp floors made of hard-packed dirt. Even in the more affluent homes and grand stone castles, The cold wooden or stone floors were thickly carpeted with cut rushes, dry straw, and fragrant herbs to provide some minor thermal insulation and a slightly softer surface to walk on. It sounds rustic and cozy, doesn't it? It was a biological nightmare. This thick layer of organic material was almost never completely swept away or entirely replaced. In most households, when the top layer of straw inevitably became too saturated with filth and began to rot, the exhausted inhabitants simply threw another fresh layer of straw directly over the mess. They were unknowingly creating a deep, festering geological sandwich of pure, dark filth that could remain trapped on the floor for decades without ever seeing the light of day. The famous scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, writing in a horrified letter during the 16th century, explicitly detailed the absolute terror hiding beneath these seemingly innocent floors. He warned that the bottom layer of these floors remained completely untouched for up to 20 years. It became a dark, humid haven that harbored dried human spit, violent vomit, the strong urine of hunting dogs and drunken men, the sticky remnants of spilled dark ale, the rotting, flesh-covered skeletons of discarded fish, and other unnameable, terrifying filth. Imagine trying to survive while living directly on top of a massive, actively rotting compost heap, right in the middle of your own living room. This warm, deeply humid and rotting organic environment served as an absolute paradise for massive, biting swarms of aggressive fleas, blood-sucking lice, and relentless bedbugs. Meals were carelessly eaten right above this mess, and the discarded bones and rotting scraps of food fell to the floor to be mercilessly trampled into the rot. This endless cycle continuously fed a massive, invisible population of crawling worms and hungry insects that would quietly creep up the legs of the terrified inhabitants every single night. The terrifying truth is that if you survived the infested beds, the brutal medical treatments would finish you off. Desperate doctors violently applied hot animal feces to open, bloody wounds to stop the bleeding, while local barbers aggressively amputated rotting limbs with rusted saws and zero anesthesia. You would feel every agonizing slice as they wiped their bloody tools on filthy aprons. Toilet paper did not exist. The desperate masses violently scraped themselves with rough leaves, while monks shared a single, feces-covered sponge tied to a stick. It was an absolute biological nightmare. But despite these terrifying conditions, our ancestors were ruthless survivors. Their desperate, bloody struggle paved the way for modern science. So the next time you take a perfectly clean shower, remember the suffocating stench of medieval London. If you want to survive the true horrors of history, don't forget to subscribe to Grim Medieval. You will not want to miss our next descent into the darkness of medieval torture dungeons.